Welcome again. This is the Scaling Up webinar series. My name is Cass Hardy, and I work for the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate. I am the team lead for the Scaling Up initiative for the Park Service, and it's our interdisciplinary team across the agency that works to provide tools that enable parks to work beyond their boundaries. And we've put together a webinar series that's been ongoing now for about 2 years. We host a webinar once or so a month. I'm sure many of you have seen them or perhaps participated in the past. We do record all the webinars, and they are posted on our Scaling Up Toolkit, which is open to all DOI staff, as well as on the Network for Landscape Conservation. So we've created a really great bank of resources if you want to check those out to learn about the other webinars that we've hosted in the past. And then similarly, you can also see upcoming webinars that we have in the near future. Today, we are lucky to have some incredible presenters joining us for today's webinar. We'll be featuring Rhonda Lowe, the Chief of Natural Resources at Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park, and Colleen Cole, the coordinator of the Three Mountain Alliance Partnership. And they'll be talking about approaches to landscape management from their perspective and their work in Hawaii. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the presentation to Rhonda to kick us off. At the end of the presentations, we'll be opening up the lines for any kind of questions or answers that folks may have for the presenters. You're also welcome to use the chat function in GoToWebinar, and we'll be managing those questions as they come in as well and asking them aloud at the end of the presentation. So with that said, thanks again for joining us, and Rhonda, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, aloha, and thank you for inviting us today. To get together, Colleen and I will be sharing with you the park's efforts, working with our partners under the Three Mountain Alliance to manage natural areas beyond the park boundaries to include the larger landscape. So I'll begin the presentation to include a brief background on the challenges of protecting island ecosystems, with Colleen following up on a description of the Three Mountain Alliance Watershed and our joint efforts to protect these priority island watersheds, and then share some of the key elements that have made the partnership successful, which include building trust and establishing strong relationships among the partners, fostering community support for the partnership through a very active education and outreach program, and one that particularly emphasizes a multicultural approach to valuing island biodiversity. Okay, so some brief background. If you weren't aware of where Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park occurs, it's located on the largest of the Hawaiian islands, Hawaii Island, and this archipelago is the most geographically remote landmass in the Pacific Ocean. It's over 2,500 miles from the nearest continental system. And it was created by volcanoes that are still active today and occurring in the national park. These islands include a range of habitats. They span from the coastal strand to alpine communities, and from dense, lush rainforests to very young, sparsely vegetated pioneer and even xeric or dry communities, all of which provide homes to hundreds of plants and animals that are entirely unique to the islands. Found nowhere else in the world, and the product of millions of years of evolution and isolation. And this natural environment fundamentally shaped the cultures of the humans that first arrived to the islands nearly 1,500 years ago from Polynesia. And with these first human arrivals and subsequent colonization by Europeans, we saw dramatic alterations to the landscape. including large areas for agriculture. And even more profound were the number of introductions of plants and animals that came with these humans, including four-legged mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects, and new species of plants that were highly invasive. And these fragile ecosystems of species are really ill-equipped to deal with these new predators, herbivores, competitors, and even the diseases that accompany them. Here's just a few examples of these new introductions that the islands experience. Four-legged mammals, including large ungulates and also reptiles, mongoose, cats, rats, and also new species of plants that were highly invasive. The impacts of these new species were quite devastating. Here's some destruction of vegetation by feral pigs in rainforests. Led to large areas eroding. There's also changes in disturbance regimes with some of these new invasive plant species. So we had fire-adapted grasses that increased the fire frequency in a lot of areas where they've invaded, and this led to local extinction of native plant species and also habitat for wildlife. So here you see a invasive strawberry guava stand replacing a native forest, and you'll see a small native tree fern trying to survive. And as a result, Hawaii Islands are often identified as the endangered species capital of the world. And the national park here in Hawaii is no exception. We provide habitat for over 50 federally threatened, endangered, and candidate species. And outside the park and the islands also experience are facing a species extinction crisis. Okay. So the challenge to save habitat and species are widespread, and it's quite daunting, and it requires really a landscape or regional approach to management. By 2011, the state of Hawaii had identified and prioritized over 1 million acres of forests at risk across the islands. These are pretty much all of the remaining native forests on the islands. And in addition to being important to species and habitat conservation, these areas are recognized as essential to groundwater recharge and maintaining the island's fresh water supply for the over 1 million inhabitants that live on these islands. So I set the stage on the challenges, and I'm going to hand off to Colleen, who will talk about what we do with our partners to address these regional issues through the Three Mountain Alliance Partnership.
All right, thank you, Rhonda.
Okay.
All right, show my screen. Aloha and good morning to everyone. It's morning here in Hawaii, or good afternoon to wherever you are. This is my first webinar, so bear with me. We'll see how it goes. So I'm the coordinator for the Three Mountain Alliance Watershed Partnership, which the park is a founding member of. And so what is a watershed partnership? In our case, it's a voluntary partnership among large landowners and non-landowning conservation organizations. And all the members are committed to managing the land for the watershed resources of the three mountains, or the three volcanoes of Kilauea, Mauna Loa, and Hualalai. And this really includes about half of the Hawaii Island. And these are all our members. And most of them actually are public agencies, state or federal. And then we have two private landowners, Kamehameha Schools, the largest private landowner in the state. It's a Hawaiian trust organization with the goal of providing education to Hawaiian children, and then the Nature Conservancy. And again, not all the members are landowners, like USGS Biological Resources Division, and the Forest Service here does not have any Forest Service lands, but they're organizations committed to conserving the natural resources. There are actually 10 watershed partnerships in the state of Hawaii on the 5 islands, and these cover over 2 million acres and involve more than 70 public and private landowners. And they're all different. Each of them were set up differently. They're very much sort of organic in how they evolve. So just because we do it one way here doesn't mean it's the same on Kauai or Maui, but we all do communicate and work together. So the Three Mountain Alliance, or TMA, as we call it for short, is the largest of the watershed partnerships at over 1 million acres. You can see on this map all the different sort of native ecosystems that make up the Three Mountain Alliance management area. 85% is dominated by native ecosystems. And in fact, the Three Mountain Alliance contains about half of the state's remaining native habitat. And so as the members have come together, we have identified priority conservation activities to address at a landscape level. And these should be no surprise: threat management, endangered species protection, research and monitoring, and restoration. Sort of addressing all the issues that Rhonda brought up when talking about Hawaii. So threat management. In Hawaii, one of the most common ways that we deal with some of our threats is through fencing. At a landscape level, members can get together and decide which areas are priority native dominated ecosystems that are usually high value with endangered species or rare species, intact native forests, and then we start to plan out what needs to be done to protect them. And usually fencing is the first task there, followed up with animal removal. And you see the variety of ways in which we do this. And yes, in the upper right-hand corner, that is an inmate. So we'll get to that a little later. So it's not hard to see the results of our fencing, and we could show you this all over the island, especially in wet forests. Once you remove the animals, after you put up a fence, it's pretty clear the forest makes a recovery. This is from one of our joint management units, and just the forest really comes back well. If there's an intact seed bank, the forest responds. So then our next major threat issue here is weed control. Rhonda talked about all the invasive species that just come flooding through our borders all the time. And so this is another thing that we've done as a membership. We actually put together a weed management plan, which was completed in 2009. And we used all the data and mapping and information from all the members to create maps of different areas of our priority target weed species. So this one tells us what our problems are and how to address them, and its information, and then also helps us then to identify what our next steps will be in that area. So, and as Rhonda talked about, Hawaii is often known as the endangered species capital of the world. And so through the work of the members, we've been able to do a lot of endangered species protection and restoration through all our hard work of protecting these large areas. We've created refugia for a lot of endangered plants and also endangered forest bird species. And on the bottom right-hand corner is a picture of the alala, or the native Hawaiian crow, which is one of the rarest birds in the world, and we're actively involved in the release right now in the Three Mountain Alliance management area. And there really wouldn't be any way to release this bird if it hadn't been for the work of the members of the last 25 years. And then in the middle photo, there is Robichaux, who works to restore very rare plants on the landscape in Hawaii. And he has been doing this, especially in the areas near the national park, for a very long time. And he just had a couple papers out, and they got a lot of press releases. It's very exciting when you see a lot of news on endangered species reintroduction. And it was great because they quoted Rob as saying, this wouldn't have been possible without this large landscape scale collaboration that we have through the Three Mountain Alliance with our state, federal, and private partners. So that was really exciting to see that. And of course, research and monitoring is really important because we need to be able to detect change on the landscape over time. We need to be able to monitor the threats. The threats are changing all the time. You know, from when we've completed management plans, of course, we have many new species now that have become priority threats. And then also, we like to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of our management and facilitate research. And then restoration. This is what everybody loves to do. This is the feel-good part. This is actually a picture of our greenhouses here at Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park. And we have large restoration projects in one of an area near the park, actually, that was formerly a ranch. And so largely through volunteer efforts, we have been restoring former pastures with native forest. And this is a great project because it's just right on the boundary of the national park where the restoration has been going on a lot longer. So we really can grow restoration efforts up the mountain. And plus people really love doing this. This is a great way to connect people to the land. So this is just a sort of before and after picture. Not pictured on the left-hand side of the screen is the national park. There's a fence and it's all intact. And then it's this kind of former pasture. And then since we've been planting in this area, we've had amazing just results. There's just a nice deep soil there, lots of rain, the plants do really well. So how does it all work? So we are, Three Mountain Alliance staff are actually university staff. So it's kind of funny, it really is this group thing to make it work. We're university staff through the University of Hawaii Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit. Some of us are housed here at Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park. Some of us are housed at the State Division of Forestry and Wildlife Office, and we have one person who sits at the Nature Conservancy Office. So, and we get funding through grants and contracts, state, federal, private. So it's really, you know, mixed. We just make it happen. And I like to say that we are the gap fillers. Three Mountain Alliance staff, we're here to assist partners, do the work for the partners, and we do whatever needs to be done to get the project accomplished. Everything from just holding the meetings to start talking about it, to planning, to getting the funding, to coordinating it, to running the contracts, to running the staff to actually implement. We kind of do whatever is needed. The university is very flexible as far as hiring and moving funds. We also have a nonprofit fiscal sponsor we work for. So we just try to make things happen. And so we try to maintain our flexibility that way. But the members also contribute quite a bit of in-kind assistance. As I mentioned, we get a lot of office space and infrastructure provided, also expertise. We often work together. You know, we'll maybe work with the Division of Forestry and Wildlife staff for a week and they come help us for a week. There's a lot of interagency work here all the time. You know, Hawaii and Hawaii Island is a really small place. Most of us have worked at several agencies or organizations during our career. There's a lot of marriages and children between all these different agencies and organizations, which it makes it, you know, easier to sort of communicate because you know people personally. And of course, like any kind of organization like ours, we have guiding documents. We have an early example of it was actually environmental assessment and natural resources management plan. And then once we grew, we had another management plan. And then I talked about our weed management plan. So these are great roadmaps for us to use. But we're not, you know, we're not stuck to this. We still remain flexible. And in fact, when issues arise all the time, we do respond to it as a group. And I just wanted to talk about this photo a little bit because this really is collaborative decision-making in action. A while back, the state received funding to manage habitat for very rare birds, including the alala, the Hawaiian crow. And there was a few areas that we had been evaluated as good recovery habitat for this bird. But the state knew this was going to be a huge project, it's going to be a long-term project, and the state took it to Three Mountain Alliance and said, we want the members, we want the TMA to help us make this decision. So we went to the sites, we had big maps, and we had a decision matrix, and we involved all the experts. You know, here we're listening to John Price, a professor at University of Hawaii, who did a lot of the habitat analysis. We've got folks from the national park and USGS and the state, and that's me in the green raincoat looking very concerned, holding maps. But this is this is really how we got it done. And I think the beauty of this collaborative decision making for members is that they can vet decisions through the membership. It's a great way to sort of try out your ideas or your what you think you're going to do, and talk it through with the members, get a lot of feedback, try and identify all the challenges ahead of time. And also you get the buy-in of the membership, and then they get your back, because sometimes these decisions can be controversial and very hard, and nobody really wants to go it alone. So this, I thought, was a neat picture showing this is us actually in action making these decisions. And today we built the fence management unit. We're currently removing the animals, and it's a great project. Okay, so I think now we're gonna, Rhonda's gonna take over, but I'm gonna advance slides.
Sounds good. So as you probably realize, there's a lot that goes into making a partnership successful, and the first being having a really good relationship among the partners, and this takes time, and ideally it will be organic and come through developing those one-on-one relationships. But it doesn't happen overnight. And in fact, Colleen refers often to the Ola'a Kilauea partnership, which was actually the first attempt among a subset of these partners to work together and pursue a common goal. And out of that partnership eventually became the Three Mountain Alliance. And we'll talk a little more about that. And the other thing is, as Colleen referred to, sometimes conservation at a large scale can be controversial. And it's really important to build community support for these larger endeavors. And early on, that was recognized. And through the Watershed Partnership, they developed an education and outreach program, Inipona no Ka'aina, which was to help foster and support an understanding of the natural environment that we have and what was at stake and what we were trying to do in terms of conservation. And also hand in hand with that was to integrate a multicultural approach in our conservation efforts. And if you've been to Hawaii, you realize it's very ethnically diverse. There's a very strong host Native Hawaiian culture. And in order to be relevant, you really needed to recognize and understand all of the values of the communities that were in and around these conservation areas. So next slide. Yeah. So Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park had begun a very ambitious conservation effort within the park boundaries beginning in the 1970s through fencing from sea level to 10,000 foot elevation. This began in the 70s and was largely completed by the 1990s. There were large, almost 170,000 acres in the park had been protected under these boundary fences and interior fences, and we were starting to see a real response in the native forest in terms of tree recovery and stand structure, and we were starting to implement rare species recovery actions, and this was important also in terms of building habitat for several rare birds. However, if you look at the map of the park, which is of this map, and the park is shown in green, you'll realize that the park was actually largely isolated, and there were large tracts of unprotected areas surrounding the park. And these were owned by two state agencies, State Public Safety, which was Kalani Correctional Prison, shown in yellow, and also the State Department of Land and Natural Resources, which was shown in pink. And also there was a private ranch directly adjacent to the park, Keoho Ranch, which was owned and operated by Kamehameha Schools. Now, by the late 80s, the state areas owned by DLNR, shown in pink, were beginning its own conservation areas in some of the areas surrounding the park, but it was essential to bring on the additional state agency in yellow, public safety, and the private land managers shown in blue if we were going to really do contiguous conservation on a landscape level. Next slide. Colleen? Yeah, and so if you look at that lower map, you can see the forest recovery occurring in the center of the picture, which is Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park. And then you'll see these lighter green patches, which were owned by the state and by Keoho Ranch, which were essentially grasslands and operating cattle ranches. And then beyond, on the right side to the east, was Kalani Correctional Prison, which actually contained within their management beautiful large tracts of forest, but which were getting impacted by cattle and pigs. So in 1994, the park, the state, and Kamehameha Schools, the operator of Keoho Ranch, and Kalani Correctional decided to form an informal partnership. And we are also assisted technically by Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and USGS, Biological Resource Division. And this informal partnership sort of was the testing ground and also provided a framework within which partner members could share information, work together to identify common ground, and formulate shared goals and projects for the area. And so Colleen will talk to you a little more about how that started.
Okay, so as Rhonda said, this all sounded really good on paper. It was this great idea. Here we have, this great forest bird habitat. We had several endangered forest bird species, and there was a lot of potential there. But you had to think about who all these people were in reality. We had we had a huge federal agency, the National Park. We had another big state agency, the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. And then we had a prison and we had a ranch. And so everybody sort of had a little bit different mandates. And so the challenge was, how do we really get people on board and how can we make it work for them? And we've kind of taken it for granted that everybody talks to each other now, but back then that wasn't always the case. And so I really want to point out one person, Larry Katahira. He was the former wildlife biologist for Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park. And I want to kind of tell a story about him because lately he's retired. And a couple months ago, I had a really nice conversation with him where he told me a really nice story about how he got everybody on board, and it was one I hadn't heard before. So he said, in the early 90s, when he was working at the park and the chief of resources management at the time, Dan Taylor, they were talking about all the work they've been doing, the habitat management, how it was going, the successes. And Dan posed a question to Larry and said, but what about the forest beyond our fences? And Larry said he thought about that for a long time, and he really felt that the work of the park could be maximized, and that the habitat of these endangered forest birds could be protected over a larger landscape, which is what they really require. And it just meant the neighboring landowners needed to all work together to achieve this level of habitat management. But this required some major relationship building. So I love these photos because it's Larry. It's Larry just talking to people with the map. You always would see Larry in the field, Larry taking folks up to the forest, Larry, holding meetings. He was always on the move doing this. He was one of the hardest challenges to overcome was to talk to the officials at the prison at Kalani Correctional Facility. Why should we, they had very clear goals, what they needed to do as a correctional facility. And they just really couldn't see how they would be part of this partnership and the risks that it would be. And Larry kept kind of hitting a wall there. And so he said, one time he was in one of the administrator's office for the umpteenth time, and he noticed that he had a guitar in the corner of his office. And he said, "Oh, you play guitar? I play a little guitar. I play a little ukulele." And so he would come in on the weekends with his ukulele and bring some food. This is real Hawaiian style. You just talk story. You sit around, you play music, you talk story, and you start to build a personal relationship. And so he spent a lot of his free time actually getting to know the people there and also getting to know the land. And that allowed them to actually kind of break down some of these perceived barriers and shared goals. And Larry was actually able to find common ground. So, for example, with the correctional facility, he convinced them that this was going to be really great on the ground training, on the job training for inmates, because they wanted to have inmate work line help to do some of this conservation management, like build fences or help control weeds. And so the same was applied to the ranch owners at the time, operated by Kamehameha Schools, whose mission was to provide education for the children of Hawaii, and restoring the forest bird habitat, and having environmental education programs was definitely in line with their goals. So this was a really important lesson, and one that I don't think is unique to Hawaii, but that really taking the time to build those relationships, build up trust. And so that allowed the members of the early formation of this partnership to start some small projects. And I think this is also really important, that you have to kind of start small and build on these successes over time. And it was important to start with projects that would be manageable, have tangible results, and that everybody got something out of, so a little bit smaller scale reforestation projects. Here at the bottom you see is fence construction projects. We actually hired a work line supervisor. So they were a 3 Mountain Alliance employee, but they went through all the training so that they could supervise a work line of inmates. And so they built miles and miles of fences in this area. And then all the landowners could see the benefit of weed control projects, especially in these high quality areas. We would choose a priority invasive species and just attack it, and then people started seeing results of that. And then educational programs, that's when we started, and we had some amazing people start these programs that brought kids into place-based curriculum. So we took them into the field, we took them into the forest, they did all the work that we were doing, they were exposed to conservation activities. So that allowed people to get really excited about the work that could be done at a landscape scale with 3 Mountain Alliance. And then over time, we went from Ola'a Kilauea Partnership, working on 32,000 acres, to becoming 3 Mountain Alliance, expanding over 1 million acres. And so you see, this is the map of all the current, the management area today, and outlined in yellow is where we started. So that just shows you what can happen when you start, with building trust, relationships, and small successful projects. So the other thing that Rhonda sort of talked about, which is equally as important as building relationships between landowners, land managers, conservation organizations, was really building community relationships and building community trust. And so this was an initiative, an effort that we put just as much energy into at the beginning and still continues very strong today. And we started with a program that we call Imi Pono no Ka'aina, or Seeking Excellence for the Land. And this the aim of this was to build up not only community awareness, but to get community, particularly kids, involved in conservation and in the natural resources of Hawaii. And so our three main thrusts of the program, which continue today, are student enrichment programs, community events, and service learning opportunities. So all of these also have a biocultural approach. Like Rhonda was saying, Hawaii is very diverse culturally, and our host culture, Native Hawaiian, has a very strong tradition and practice here, and a lot of knowledge. And so we build that into all our offerings. So in this picture, we're running a student program that was native plants and their uses, which every day was a new plant, and the students learned about the ecology of the plant, the traditional uses of it, and then actually would make something out of it or use it in that way. And so we want to provide a more comprehensive offering. And our student programs are really, we're very proud of them. We find they're very effective. We've had a lot of early participants in these student programs, which have been going on almost 20 years now. They're now professionals in the field. They're place-based programs. They emphasize conservation, science, culture, stewardship, art, and of course, fun. We definitely try and make it fun. It doesn't work if it's not fun. And we take them all over the island. And this also builds capacity. There was a time when there wasn't a lot of recruitment from local students interested in conservation to working in conservation in Hawaii. There just wasn't quite the ladder in place there, and we're working to build that. But today, we're definitely seeing the fruits of many different environmental education initiatives that now have resulted in locals becoming professionals running the conservation organizations here today. And so I think we're switching it back over to Rhonda now. Rhonda?
Sorry about that, had it on mute. So again, having that multicultural approach was important to be relevant to our communities. And this also includes within the park, in fact, our BioBlitz events that we're doing nowadays incorporates a bicultural approach to BioBlitz. So our theme was Ikanana no Aike, or by observing one learns. And the goals of our BioBlitz was to really bring the cultural practitioners, the scientists, the conservation community, and the local communities together to celebrate biodiversity from their own cultural perspectives, and also to share it. And so next, if you see, we actually had these field inventories where they were co-led by both alakai, or cultural practitioners, and also by the scientists. And then back to you, Colleen.
Sorry, I was muted. That's a problem. Okay, the future, where does this bring us today? Through partnerships, what can you do? You can affect landscape scale conservation. That's what we've been talking a lot about. Why is it not advancing? We can leverage the funds and resources of many groups. And this is a really important point, and I don't want to just sort of gloss over it. I think everybody goes through funding up and down cycles, right? There are times when the state is going through a budget crisis, and the federal agencies and private organizations can kind of cover that gap. There are times when federal agencies are going through budget cuts, and then we all sort of step in. And so this is more and more important all the time, and it provides a safety net. And so no landscape scale projects are going to fall through the cracks. Equally as important, I think, is just communication, transfer of information among all the different players of conservation. It's amazing how hard sometimes it can be to communicate with each other, especially given, phones, computers, meetings all the time. But I find that it's really important to make sure we're always on the same page all the time, and this allows us to be more efficient and more responsive to new threats or opportunities. And then really importantly too is to bring private landowners to the table where they have an equal voice, an equal say. They're involved in these big decisions. And for some private landowners, this is the only time they're able to really be involved with big landscape scale decisions that affect their lands. And probably the most important, I guess, lesson that we're learning about being part of a partnership that works together on a landscape scale that allows us all to be so much more resilient. You know, the future is so uncertain in terms of what's happening with climate change or budgets or things like this, but if working together to address and manage on this level, it really gives us a lot more resiliency, safety nets, all those things. So we just wanted to leave you with a short video about the park's BioBlitz that we think is a pretty neat video and kind of showcases what we do. And then after that, we'd be happy to take any questions. So let me just get this going. Hopefully you can all hear it.
We're chanting to show respect to the land and all the animals and plants and insects that live here. So that's why we chant. It's for us to show that we're here for a purpose, and we have to be mindful while we're here. We have to know that there's other animals that live here, and this is their home, not our home.
Hi.
Okay, guys, this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance for us to make a difference. So
that's right. Students, scientists, and alakahi are going to be coming together, and in a 24-hour period, we're going to be looking at all the native plants, birds, animals, everything we can record in 24 hours for the BioBlitz.
Crazy, right?
Imagine if hundreds of students like you and I join hundreds of scientists, parents, uncles, aunties, and kapunas
To take an inventory of life. Live! To take an inventory of life.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to both Rhonda and Colleen. At this time, we will be opening up all the lines. If you have a question, you can certainly plug your question into the question box through GoToWebinar as well. It may just take me a minute or so to open up all the lines. If anyone wants to go ahead and plug a question in that box, they can get us started. Okay, I think I've unmuted everyone. Does anyone want to get us started with a question?
This is John Dennis.
Go ahead.
Can I be heard?
Yep, you can be heard, John. Go ahead.
Great. My question is, the formation of the partnership takes time and dedication of individuals. Is there a mechanism being built to transfer the leadership of the partnership from each of the partners into the next generation of future partners?
That's a really good question, John. Hi, this is Rhonda.
Hi, Rhonda.
You know, not formally. You know, I think it's really right now up to the individual member reps to cultivate support within their own organization for that next generation. And I think by continuing to do these sort of joint projects and for the Park Service, having TMA staff embedded in our field station, it emphasizes our support and for the continuation of this partnership. So so far it's not a formal framework. It's really up to those individual members who are currently participating to emphasize to the next generation the importance of that, of keeping invested in that partnership.
And it sounds like the current members are thinking in terms individually in their own organizations about fostering the next generation.
Yes, that's my impression. Maybe Colleen has something to add to that.
Yeah, that is a really good question. And we do have, there are some initiatives aimed at fostering and nurturing the upcoming professionals. And so there's a different programs, like we have a Kupu internship program, which provides 10-month internship experiences with conservation agencies, and most of us participate in that and often usually hire directly after that, these interns. But yeah, like Rhonda says, it's definitely up to each agency, but there's also other programs that are really trying to recruit more professionals and do more professional development within these agencies.
And I will say too that the state has gone a long way in providing support not only for the Three Mountain Alliance, but all of the watershed partnerships, and they have done a lot in terms of making the state island residents statewide aware of the importance of these watersheds partnerships. So I think there's a lot of awareness on the ground of these different partnerships across all of the islands. And I think as long as people have that in their mind, these partnerships will continue to thrive.
Great. And just multiple comments in the question box saying excellent presentation and information. Others saying certainly worth sharing far and wide. One other question about who do you use as sort of your fiscal or fiduciary agent to hold funding as different money sources come in? How do you have that organized?
That's a real art, let me tell you. That's the trick in itself. So we are university employees, and if funding and often funding can be diverted different places, but if it's for staff time, things like that, then it can either go straight to the university, usually through the state Department of Land and Natural Resources, or we have a 501c3 fiscal sponsor, the Three Mountain Alliance Foundation, which sometimes funding goes there, sometimes it stays there, sometimes it moves to the university to pay for staff time. But yeah, that is, there's about a few different ways that we can take in funding and apply it to the conservation. But most of it ends up going to the university to support because that's the infrastructure that we have, and it provides us a lot of really good infrastructure and all the things you need for your employees, and so that's where most of it ends up.
This is John Dennis again. Do you feel that the nonprofit foundation is a key component in holding the fiscal world together for the Three Mountain Alliance?
Increasingly so, yes. We just went through a change with our fiscal sponsor, and so I'm more involved this time in that and more aware of it. But yes, more and more, there's some funding sources that will only go to a 501c3. And yes, it's becoming almost, I think all the watershed partnerships here have to work with a nonprofit fiscal sponsor. It just allows us to be more flexible and go for more diverse funding sources.
Okay. Other questions for our presenters? Okay, hearing none, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation today. We will be adding it to our bank of webinar series recordings. Just a reminder to all the participants, our next webinar is September 11th. We'll be featuring the Los Angeles Wildlife Crossing with Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area Superintendent David Szymanski, as well as the National Wildlife Federation Regional Executive Director Beth Pratt. So if you can tune in for that one, it'll be at 3 Eastern, noon Pacific, and should be a really fascinating presentation. Thanks again to Rhonda and Colleen today, and we'll see you all in a month or so.
This has
Thank
been
you.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.